This week on Talk by Turner, we're taking a look at a huge topic in American politics today, the Supreme Court. We'll be discussing some of the biggest headlines around the Supreme Court from the past few weeks, as well as diving into the history and context around the court and its sometimes controversial rulings. From immigration to abortion to presidential immunity, the Supreme Court has shaped the U.S. in so many ways. And today on Talk, we're asking the question, why does the system work the way it does? And how has the court impacted American life in general? Let's get into it. I'm your host, Jeffrey Colon, and you're listening to Talk by Turner. Talk by Turner dives deep into intellectual discovery while examining what's happening in our world right here, right now. Join us each week to hear from industry experts and published authors as they share their knowledge and insight on today's most important topics. Now, let's see who's on this week's episode. This week, we're joined by Matt Beat, YouTuber, video producer, podcast host, and musician. He's taught various subjects in the classroom from grades 7 through 12, and his YouTube channels, Mr. Beat and The Beat Goes On, have accumulated over 1 million subscribers and 300 million views, helping expand his classroom around the world. Beat's specialty is American history, but he also has a big passion for geography, economics, and politics. Matt, welcome to Talk.
Thanks for having me.
So you have a huge following online. You have over 1 million subscribers on YouTube, thousands of followers on other platforms. A lot of your videos are about current political events and how they fit into American history. And these days, that kind of content is becoming increasingly popular and is even replacing traditional media as people's main sources of information. So my question to you is, what are the pros and cons that you see of social media becoming people's primary source of news, information, and learning history?
Well, the pros and cons are probably the same. So the pro is that it's never been easier to get informed about things. However, the con is also it's never been easier to get informed by things, because that means whoever produces the information could be a bad actor, or they could just get all the facts wrong, or just cover up their own bias, and you think that they're telling you 100% the truth and they're not. It's overwhelming, and so it's very, I think these days we need experts more than ever, I think. Even though, ironically, at the same time, this is like probably the era of like not trusting experts. Everybody's like, whoa, no, just do your own research, man. But at the same time, like, no, we need to lean on the experts. So, and when I say I'm an expert, I'm not really an expert at anything. However, I'm trying to be an expert at communicating political history. That's pretty much what I'm trying to. But even then, I'm like, hey, I'm getting my information from other experts. I encourage you to also explore what they have to say. Don't just take my word for it, you know? So yeah, it's...
Let's dive into the Supreme Court here for a second. What's a common misconception that the average person might have about what the Supreme Court does and how the court functions?
I think a misconception is that they are extremely political. The 9 people in the Supreme Court are actually not as ideological as people think and not as driven by politics. For one, they don't get elected, they're appointed, and they have lifetime appointments, and so they're immune from the day-to-day politics out there. They can just ignore the noise and kind of focus on each case. And so often they will surprise you. You might think they lean to the left politically or to the right politically, and then they come out with an opinion that's like, oh, that's completely different than I anticipated. we've been seeing that actually a lot in the last couple of years. Basically, we have Republican appointed justices or justices that were appointed by President Trump that have basically come out against Trump policies because they're, it's the only way they can get out of office is be impeached, and there's only been one Supreme Court justice impeached in American history, and they were acquitted. They were not thrown out of office. So they're pretty much there.
Who was that Supreme Court justice who was impeached? I'm just curious.
His name was Samuel Chase, and this was in the early years of the Republic. And I always tell people it's kind of funny because he was impeached by Congress for being too political. Like, that was their argument that, you just don't like, this one political party. And so, some things never change.
Question on education when it comes to how the government functions. Do you think the education system in the United States adequately teaches students about the different branches of government and how they work together?
No, absolutely not. I mean, some states do a better job than others, but overall, I believe there are pretty big inadequacies. Like, I think there's 8 or 9 states that don't require you take a government class in order to graduate high school. So that's just one example. Since the early aughts, basically since No Child Left Behind, a law that Congress passed to try to focus more on raising test scores on math and science, the STEM fields, basically the social sciences have been pushed to the back burner overall. So it's not just government, it's American history, world history, economics, geography. So there's just this cultural shift that's been happening over the past 25 years in which school boards and school leaders have not prioritized social sciences as much. And so I think we're starting to see the consequences of that. We're starting to see adults now that don't know basic facts about the government. And I'm not just saying that like as an old crank. I'm saying that we have evidence to back this up. There are actually studies now. There's data out there if you want to look for it. I actually did a live stream about this recently that backs up what I'm saying, that there's actually been a decline in social sciences education. On the flip side, though, that just means that, hey, my videos are doing better than ever because people are seeking this stuff out on their own, thankfully, still.
So the United States was founded on the concept of checks and balances, meaning no single branch of government has more power than the other. In our current political environment, where do you see checks and balances falling, and where do you see them succeeding?
I think in the early days of the country, the legislative branch was by far the most powerful, and that's kind of how the founding fathers intended it to be. They knew the legislative branch was the branch that represented the people. It's the people's branch, We elect that branch more directly than, say, the president, which is elected by electoral college, and of course justices, which are not elected at all. However, what has happened throughout American history is the Supreme Court has got more and more power. Part of that is because Congress has kind of delegated that because they've deferred a lot of things. They don't make as many important laws as they used to, which is kind of weird to say out loud, but it's true. But also the president, more dramatically, has gained a lot of power. And I'm not just talking about the current administration. This goes back to Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, George W. Bush. All of these are presidents that incrementally grew the power of the presidency. And I think a large reason why all this has happened is because what was supposed to be the most important branch of government, the legislative branch, Congress, has just given up that power. And I think it's probably long past due that they get it back.
Which leads me to my next question that sort of ties into this. If we look at, current examples, President Trump has talked about unconstitutionally running for a third term as president. So in a case like this, what's the responsibility of the rest of the government to keep that check in balance? And what would that look like?
Well, for that example, it's pretty cut and dry. It's pretty clear. The 22nd Amendment says that you can only be in office for 2 terms. I mean, there's that weird situation if a vice president takes over halfway, and they could theoretically be president for as much as 10 years. But he cannot run for another term. So if he were to try, then that means he'd be going against the Constitution, which he took an oath on the Constitution when he swore upon, like when he entered office, he swore upon the Constitution, as does every member of Congress, as does every member of the military, as does every justice. They swear an oath on the Constitution. So yeah, like it's their duty to basically, if somebody breaks the Constitution, to impeach them. When I say they, I mean Congress. The House of Representatives has to do that. Does that mean they will? I don't know. Like these days, things are kind of iffy. So it's a little bit of a tumultuous time.
Recently, the Supreme Court made headlines siding with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who is a Maryland man mistakenly deported to an El Salvadoran prison. And since this ruling, the White House has sent mixed messages about whether they will actively try to get Abrego Garcia returned to the U.S. My question for you, based on your experience teaching and discussing U.S. history, what is the historical precedent for disagreements between a sitting president and the Supreme Court? And where does the current administration fit within this historical context?
It's very rare for the president to just ignore the Supreme Court or clash with them. Andrew Jackson kind of ignored the Supreme Court when it came to a case called Worcester v. Georgia, in which this was in the 1830s, but they were trying to forcibly remove Native American tribes, notably the Cherokee, from northern Georgia because they wanted that land and the resources there. When I say they, I mean the Georgian government. And so it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee and said that the federal government cannot force, or the Georgia government cannot force the Cherokee off their land. But the Georgia government did anyway, and the president did nothing to stop them. And then later on, the federal government actually aided them as well. So yeah, like that was the first instance. However, like it wasn't quite blatant like it is now. Like I know that the Trump administration is saying, hey, our hands are tied. This is up to El Salvador to release him. This is out of our jurisdiction. However, that's less credible because they've done other things to free other prisoners, in other circumstances. And so they're just inconsistent with that, which makes it less credible. As far as other clashes, though, with the Supreme Court, I guess Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, where he was like, he wasn't liking the Supreme Court overturning his New Deal legislation. And so he's like, well, maybe Congress just needs to add more members to the court. That actually famously got him in trouble with the press when they said, oh, you're trying to pack the court. What are you doing, man? And so he kind of backed off. But to credit, to swing in the direction of Roosevelt, the Supreme Court ended up siding with his New Deal legislation after that anyway. So it all worked out in the end for Roosevelt. But yeah, like those are the only 2 examples I can think of comparable.
In your opinion, which cases, and I'm going to put you on a stump here, from the past 20 years, from headline-making cases to lesser-known cases, have had the most significant impact on people's everyday lives in the U.S., and in what way?
I know Citizens United versus FEC gets all the attention, and yeah, rightfully so. Like the fact that it reaffirmed the fact that, of course, this is already stated earlier, but it reaffirmed the fact that corporations are people. And I know a lot of people really cringe when they hear that, but like from a legal standpoint, a corporation has the same legal protections. Unfortunately, you can't send a corporation to prison, though. So, but the other part of Citizens United is that it just kind of opened up the floodgates in terms of funding for elections, and it's not just individuals donating, like a billionaire donating a bunch of money to one candidate. It's these kind of nefarious secret, they call it dark money, like the money that goes into campaigns, and you don't know exactly where it's coming from, but we kind of really do know, because it's just a few rich people that are funding all these elections and swaying public opinion. And it doesn't always work, but often it does. So that's the first case. The other case I bring up is Shelby County v. Holder, which gets less attention. That one was in 2014, I believe, maybe 2013. That case dealt with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That law was first passed because, the southern states were trying to prevent African Americans from voting, and this was an attempt to fight back against that. And so what it did is it made the federal government micromanage these state governments that were up to shenanigans preventing African Americans from voting. Well, flash forward to this case, Shelby County v. Holder, and by this time, a lot of things had changed, but the Supreme Court ultimately said, hey, parts of the Voting Rights Act don't apply anymore. I think that we can lay off, the federal government can lay off these states and let them have more freedom to run their own elections, because there's nothing in the Constitution specifically about how states should run their own elections. But what we've seen happen in the last 10 or 11 years since that decision is states have not just southern states, but a lot of other states have suppress the vote. And they do this not just to target African Americans or other, they're really just, I think it's to keep power. So you see this a lot with states in which the minority group has power and they're worried they're going to lose that power. And so examples of voter suppression include you have to have extra ID in order to vote. You can't vote early. They shut down voting locations. There's just all kinds of little things they can do that are technically legal, but they make it harder for especially poor people to vote. And so that's, I think, a case. Now, there's other cases that may have a bigger impact, but I think we need more time to pass. Like the one that people bring up a lot that passed, the decision from last year, Trump v. United States. That one, who knows? That could be really dramatic, but we just don't know yet. It hasn't been tested that much yet.
In your opinion, do you see the Supreme Court, both its past members and the current justices serving on it, as a truly impartial voice of constitutional interpretation?
No, nobody's truly impartial anyway. However, to their credit, they know the law. There's never been a Supreme Court justice who didn't know their stuff. Almost all of them passed the bar, although that's not a requirement. Anybody can be on the Supreme Court. I always joke around that my 10-year-old daughter could be on the Supreme Court because there's nothing in the Constitution that says she couldn't. However, everyone has biases. I think with the Supreme Court, fortunately, a lot of times they've leaned heavily on their predecessors. So, and precedent, the idea that whatever decisions were passed or that were decided long ago, they take a higher priority and they influence how we decide on future cases. And so I think that's a really powerful thing. That's why it's really rare to see the Supreme Court overturn previous decisions. So yeah, I think a lot of people still worry about the Supreme Court when really, a lot of times they kind of are more traditional. They don't want to shake things up too much.
Interesting. So they don't want to cause turbulence, basically. They want to sort of keep, you noted precedents, so they like to
Yeah.
Sort of
Also,
agree with their own agreements is for lack of a better description.
yeah, self-preservation might even be part of it too, because I don't think they like, even though they're not a political branch, not supposed to be, they still feel the public pressure. They still know that right now that there are there are public opinion polls that show they're not very popular. I think they think about that a lot, and whatever wins whatever direction the political winds are going, I think that they are very well aware of that. And I think a great example is the Obergefell v. Hodges, that decision that legalized same-sex marriage. Like, there are justices that like, okay, yeah, this is we've changed as a society, and I feel like we can interpret the Constitution in a different way now. Yeah, yeah. So I think they're more in touch than we give them credit for, if that makes sense. Yeah.
What's your take on life terms for the Supreme Court? Are you for? Are you against? And why?
I used to be okay with it. In recent years, I've kind of changed my mind, and I think that it's, as long as it's a long term, like, I think it's reasonable to have a term limit as long as it's at least 20 years, maybe longer, because you still don't want it to be a political appointment. Also, the older I get, like, I went back and kind of read what Franklin Roosevelt wrote in the 1930s about packing the court. Like, he didn't use that term, but he kind of made a lot of sense. Like, I know, like, when I taught American history in the classroom, I used to teach it in the way like, oh yeah, he did this radical thing. Like, he was proposing this radical idea, but actually, if you go back and read it, it's pretty reasonable, especially considering how unpopular the Supreme Court is today. Like, if you have a justice who's going to stay there for 50 years, then yeah, you need some younger folks in there to kind of. I think that the root of so many of our problems today in government is that so many older folks are just clinging on to power. They're not giving up the power, and I think that's why a lot of younger voters in particular are disillusioned. So
staying on sort of the expansion of the court, do you think having more justices would significantly alter the way the court operates? And if so, in what way? Let's say we expanded the court, later this year, would it operate differently?
Well, later this year, that means that President Trump would get more nominations, and they would probably get through, despite a narrow majority in the Senate. So yeah, like, we could probably have, I mean, Alito and Thomas are the more right-leaning justices on there. We've seen the other supposed right-leaning justices as being more pragmatic, or at least all over the place ideologically. And so really, it just depends on who he gets in there. But a lot of times, like, I think presidents will nominate someone and they think they're going to vote a certain way, but they really don't know. And so I think it really is like, I have no idea. Like, yeah, it could end up. I mean, the most famous example we have of this is George H.W. Bush, so the Bush Sr., nominated David Souter, who was had a record of supposedly being a conservative judge, but then he gets on the Supreme Court, and then throughout the years he just becomes clearly more left-leaning. And so, this is another misconception. The older most people get, I think, the more they lean to the left. I've seen this with my own family, like. There's that myth that, oh, you get old and you become more bigoted and closed-minded, like, oh, kids. But actually, young people do influence older people, and older people do kind of change over time. So
yeah, it's interesting. I had an aunt who was very much like that, and I always cite that to people who say, like, oh, you get more rigid as you age. It's like, I don't know. We all have people in our families who.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't.
Yeah. Right on.
What do you hope listeners will take away from today's episode?
Well, I usually stick up for the Supreme Court, and maybe I shouldn't, but I think they need to take away that this is the smartest branch of government. And that might really irritate some folks to hear. It is. Like, they know the law better than anyone in the other two branches does. They are all well educated and pretty thoughtful overall, even Clarence Thomas, even Samuel Alito, though there are corruption, like questions with those two. But yeah, so I think we should generally not be too afraid of the Supreme Court. And yeah, there have been pretty big missteps in recent years. I know a lot of people were still very upset, obviously, about the Dobbs v. Jackson decision that overturned Roe v. Wade and created all this chaos. And I just can't imagine if I was a woman, like, having to go through all that, because as a man, I can't even begin to think of what they're going through. So yeah, that aside, I will say the Supreme Court is mostly not a big concern. I think it's more concerning what's happening in the executive branch. That's where everybody should be more concerned, regardless of your political affiliation, Democrat, Republican. That power has just grown exponentially compared to the Supreme Court.
Matt, where can listeners find you online?
If you just search you might get Mr. Beast at first, but just scroll down a little bit and you'll see my pages. My main platform is on YouTube, but I'm also on, TikTok, Instagram, pretty much everywhere.
And what's the title of your latest book? Just curious, so listeners and viewers are aware of it.
The book is called The Power of Our Supreme Court, and I just pick 100 Supreme Court cases that I think are the most important to know, tell the story about them. It's very similar to I have a series called Supreme Court Briefs, and so I was inspired to write this book based on that series. So making legalese easy to understand, translating legalese, that's what the book is. So this is for anyone, not just law students.
Nice. Matt Beat, thanks for joining us here on Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Talk by Turner, hosted by Jeffrey Colon. Watch and listen now wherever you enjoy podcasts.